Hallo und herzlich willkommen.
Hello, welcome back to this panel. Do we need a humanitarian Zeitenwende? I'm Sonja Hövelmann. I'm working as a scientific assistant for the Center for Humanitarian Action, and I would like to ask everyone to sit down, to take your seats, so that we can start on time and so that our online guests don't have to sit so long in front of this empty screen. Welcome, first of all, our guests, Simone Schnabel, Sarah Bressan, and Christian Katzer, who will come to the stage in a minute and will accompany us during this panel. But I also would like to welcome all our guests in this room and online. Before we start, let me give you some technical ideas which were not mentioned at the beginning due to this time constraints with State Secretary Baumann and the Deputy Nuripur. In this building, you're obliged to wear a mask. In this room, you don't have to, but you may. But we would kindly ask you, when you leave the room, on your way to the bathrooms, please wear a mask. Toilets are in the ground floor, if you haven't discovered them yet, and there is also a winter garden. Or if you have to write an email, or if you have to do other business, you have the opportunity to sit down there.
To English, because for our online guests, this panel will be in German, but English translation is provided. To activate it, please use the world icon in your Zoom utilities bar. With the English version, we also have live captioning. To activate it, please check with the chat. They will provide further information. Please also be mindful of the housekeeping rules for our online guests that are shared, and contact the CHA technical chat for any queries or hiccups. And if you are following us in the live stream, but want to hear the panel in German, please make sure that you join the Zoom conference. And for our dear guests here at BUM, if you want to follow the conversation in English, please make sure that you have a translation device that is given out at the registration desk. With that, I will switch back to German und würde noch
And now, having switched back to German, I will give you some more details regarding the questions. We have a standardized procedure, as we heard already in the prior panels. So feel free to take part in our discussion with your questions. You have the microphones in this room, and at the end of this meeting, you can also follow online. You can write your questions to the chat, or confidentially, you can also write to Andrea Steinke, who will then answer your questions or switch or bring in your questions at the end of our discussion. The Russian aggression to Ukraine has triggered a very lively debate about priorities of German foreign and security politics. And we heard already in the first panel what the strategic challenges will be in the future. And especially for this defense policy, we also have created the term of Zeitenwende in Germany. However, this turn of an era could also refer to strategies, capacities, and instruments of crisis prevention and crisis commitment. So that's why we want to discuss today what it could mean for German commitment in crises and conflicts. And apart from this exchange with other areas such as peace and security, there is also the question, as we heard in the first panel, whether this could also trigger a pivot, or which it may need a pivot or change of direction in funding, which is rather based on monopolistic view, or whether we would need more localization. And of course, there are the enormous challenges of climate change, which we can see looming at the horizon. That is why we would like to ask whether it takes a humanitarian turn or pivot. And we also want to delimit this, whether it's necessary to have this pivot, which provides these also solutions for the humanitarian systems. But before we are going to start, let's give you a view to the donor Germany And we want to show you what the research has had as an outcome regarding German aid. And I would like to ask my colleague to give you the details. To your left, okay. I'm not going to stand in your way. Let me go to this side. Let's show the next slide, please. Thank you. In summer, we had a survey on the international perception of Germany as a humanitarian player, and there were 4 major results which I would like to share with you today. First of all, who were the respondents? We asked humanitarian experts from 52 countries who also have a rather diverse institutional background, be it UN members, Red Cross, but also some local NGOs. And altogether, 200 people answered the questions. That means that the outcome is rather indicative and not necessarily can be generalized. The first finding is whether Germany is an honest broker in humanitarian affairs. And the answer is that more than half of the respondents see Germany as a very value-based donor. And when you add other voices, even it's 80% who see Germany as an honest broker. We had another question to support this. The question was, what drives Germany's aid spending? And 6 answers were possible. 3 were rather egoistic and 3 were interest-based, and a vast majority of 70% of the respondents said it was rather an altruistic way of spending by Germany. However, when we divide between people from Germany and from abroad, you see that among those living in Germany, the most frequent category was actually geopolitical and migration-based motivations for funding, whereas abroad they would rather see altruistic motives such as the strengthening of the humanitarian systems or the use of the handling of humanitarian crises. That brings me to a second major result, that is the international perception, which obviously was much more positive than the domestic view. Depending on where people are working, let's come back to the question whether Germany is an honest broker. People abroad were rather more positively seeing that question. And the third finding is that as Mr. Köhler has already pointed out this morning, Germany's political commitment could be much more supported by financial support. And regarding the humanitarian system, the role of Germany as the second largest donor, whether it was reflected in the humanitarian system. And we can see here among the respondents, they were rather undecided. 1/3 was in agreement with that statement, and the rest was not. Some more clarity can be seen when looking at this diagram, which shows the Germans' impact on the tests among the 10 largest donors and their humanitarian policy. And you see only those who are perceived as being very influential. In the first place, of course, there is the United States, followed by the EU and UK, and on place 4, Germany comes in. The fourth finding of this survey is that the respondents did not see a very clear thematic priority, and especially in Germany, they were lacking the anticipative humanitarian aid. And we asked, what were the 7 priorities where German players were present especially, and 1/3 mentioned the nutrition security and food and nutrition security and wash, and then healthcare and humanitarian protection came in. That shows at least that there is not a very clear setting of priorities by Germany regarding Germany's humanitarian commitment. A similar picture could be seen for policy priorities. We ask for 10 different subjects. On place 1, not surprisingly, anticipative humanitarian aid is perceived as one subject where Germany has a lot of influence. And the second and third place nexus, that is the intertwining of humanitarian aid and peace, and grandfathering came in as number 3. Well, that's the moment to hand over to Ralph, who, apart from the survey, will also give you some outcomes of certain interviews. Very much so. Let me also describe the methodology. We also wanted to find out if there is a humanitarian reform required for Germany, which has been discussed for decades but is coming on very slowly. What is the strength and weaknesses of humanitarian aid? What does Germany have to offer in terms of policy? What's the German position on this way from a payer towards a player? And here also we had 37 interviews, especially in Western capitals, in hubs in New York, Geneva. We made these interviews, half of them with representatives of politics, 10 NGOs, local, international, and Red Half Moon. We had 2 other interviews, and we also had interviews with 5 UN representatives to find the right balance, focusing mainly on global north and perspectives from the global north so far. And the outcomes of those interviews reflected, on the one hand, very much what could be also seen in the survey, and in particular the outcome that there is a big potential in Germany for humanitarian aid, being an honest broker as compared with other donors, but not necessarily they would see that the potential is sufficiently used so far. And we could also see from the interviews what the real causes could be and how this could be changed. Just briefly, let me mention 5 or 6 core statements, and we will give you some quotes which are describing our general perception, which can also be seen in our paper. First, the motivation. Why is Germany in such a special role? And as we could see also in the survey, when you ask them openly, what is the characteristic of German humanitarian aid, without speaking of the a very principled donor, was the answer we were given very often. And a large portion of the respondents link this to the fact that Germany could take the leadership in ensuring the European landscape and in the humanitarian area. To what extent is Germany already using this potential was another question. And in the past and retrospectively, there was a clear statement of Jan Egeland. They said, when you came, there was not much to discuss 5 years ago. That was really rather a big imbalance between rather high funding and policy impact. But today the situation is that there is a clear picture, meaning that Germany, in a thematic profile, when you ask what is actually done by Germany internationally, one subject is coming up very often in the interviews, even if you don't ask for them, that indeed since 2021 there is anticipatory action. That is something people feel is very typical for Germany in humanitarian systems. When you further ask for similar subject, it gets much thinner or more diverse, one could say. And regarding the conclusion, the capability for a strategy, one donor representative from the European context clearly told us that Germany presently does not have the capability, not even by staffing or by the UK or ECHO, to play in all fields, but there's also a lot of discussion required what other subjects should be prioritized following the anticipatory aid. And it goes in line with the German strategy. In 2009, Germany set up its last strategy. They said subject number 1, humanitarian, access, then a call for action, but the other subjects such as innovation, forgotten crises, etc., there was no feedback in that sense. So capability for a new strategy of Germany is rather seen as being limited in those interviews. Regarding the root causes, we had more mentioned the lack of prioritization, but also there was one opinion where there were some gaps. There is a massive positive perception of the presence of Germany in practically all international forums, that they are also well prepared and acting very professionally in those meetings. But again and again, it comes back to the question that it's not really clear what agenda Germany really has and what subjects they want to bring forward, what Germany wants to achieve. That could be summarized in this sentence, which Sonja Hövelmann also reflects in her paper. Another aspect which I would like to share with you at two levels is that you could see the soft and hard power influence of Germany. And what we do in our paper is that we want to see the military, economic, and other power is contrasted with credibility, and there were two deficits mentioned in many interviews. That is astonishing how little of its hard power Germany is using in order to bring forward any changes. That is different than in other foreign policy aspects. There is the wish for more leadership, for more clarity, for more priorities, and also for more pressures to move onwards. But it's also, when looking to soft power issues, there is a big deficit that Germany is lacking networking and alliances forming, etc. And one of our colleagues in Europe, of a big donor, told us they had never been invited by the German embassy. Obviously, other embassies are handling this differently. We mentioned Sweden, for example. There is a big commitment on Sweden, how some of the smaller donor states work in these policy areas. And there is also one hint for structural challenges in Germany by saying Germany has a massive deficit of fluctuation, and that's why it's very difficult to develop a soft power, because no networks can be formed, no personal relationships are formed due to very fast fluctuation or rotation of jobs and competencies. If there are such competencies, be the development ministry or the agricultural ministry, they are also in charge of food issues, etc., and questions like that. So Ms. Hövelmann and myself, just to summarize our outcome, we draw the following conclusions and recommendations, which also are based on these quotations. There is needed more thematic prioritization. For instance, S can be done in the anticipatory action, as we could see in some areas. If you can't be present at all subjects, you should at least prioritize some clear subjects and communicate this also. We should have a better cooperation with other partners via these soft power skills, but there should also be more staff, clearly more staff in that area, and less rotation in order to build up knowledge management and know-how, following the example of other donors. And ideally, it should also go to into the new strategy, which has to be written next year. And how to implement all this, this is something which our panel wants to answer. But fortunately, this is not my job anymore. And I will take away this table as well. Thank you very much. So please come up to the stage. Well, after this introduction, Germany is now starting a discussion for a change of our foreign policy and also for the preparation of the new national strategy, security strategy. And I'm very happy to welcome Sarah Foreman. And Sarah, I would like to start with you. As an introduction, Sarah Bressan is a scientific assistant at the Global Public Policy Institute. Her main focus is international security, conflict prevention, and the role of technology and forward-looking strategy in foreign and security policy. Apart from that, she's also involved in the debates on the national security strategy as a member of the team of 49 Security, and she is also trying to have a better think-tanking sector. Thank you for having you today, Sarah. As I said, you are following intensely the debates on the new first national security strategy for Germany, and there are more and more assessments that show that not only financially but also thematically this will be rather an area of conflict than just an area of cooperation between humanitarian and defense institutions in Germany. So perhaps you can give us some insight how inclusively these debates are handled right now in this time, and what is the role of humanitarian security, and whether, in spite of the rhetorics, these areas are forgotten. Thank you, Sonja. I'm very happy to be here, although normally I'm working in the security and peace fields, but the link to humanitarian areas is also part of the nexus, which I have to deal in my projects very often. And so it's also close to my heart, and I'm very happy that we can discuss it today. The national security strategy, the change of the era, I think it has gone down with everyone now, even across the borders of Germany, that this is a very interesting subject. For instance, I had a discussion with Ulrich Kiesewetter from the CDU. He said that this change of the era, this Zeitenwende, should actually have been started after the first invasion of Russia to Crimea, and it was then when German politicians said we need more international responsibility, Germany has to change, and we are now having a different strategic situation. But it did not work out, so we could not move on, and that is why we have the Zeitenwende now. So there will be a new national security strategy, and one news which you just mentioned, which we tried to push through right from the beginning, is what does strategy mean? That means to set targets and to use strategic resources. It also means where do we have to take the money away and where should we invest it? And when you look at the debate which is going on right now, and when you talk to the people who have responsibility, the answers very often you get is everything has the same priority, and everything we did in the past will keep its priority, and so nothing will change. To me, this is not very credible, because it looks like we have a debate currently in Germany that at the international level, at the economic level, due to the aggression of war into Ukraine and the effects of that, Germany's future is not really bright. And we also can see in the budgetary negotiations that everything which goes beyond this year is taken with a pinch of salt. So we have to look at the situation first, but it does not translate into political priorities yet. And in the discussion about the consequences when it comes to other areas, such as defense policy, etc., such as the defense minister said yesterday at the Federal Academy for Security Policy. So there is a lot of room for maneuver. And that means that human security, politically, you asked for that. In my view, this will be in the focus of this new security strategy. The question is, however, what does it mean? And in the White Book of 2016, we also had this term, and as a statement of the German government, but then it was just a little box. So when you look for it, you just find a gray box where there is a little bit about human security. I hope this time it will not be the same, but at the same time, I believe that it's very important to see how can we realize that they are taken serious about human security. Are there approaches which we had before the Russian aggression, and where we had a right analysis, because human security had been seen through the glasses of human security be implemented? But when you look at the election campaign, and the parties in the last election campaign, those parties who said Nord Stream 2 is a problem and all the things which now have turned out to be a real problem, they were looking forward. And they would also were looking what the potentially affected people were like. And this is actually the approach of human security. And when you look further into the future, in the altruistic foreign policy, which is now being discussed, you see the analysis were right, but the fact is whether this will also reflect in the security strategy and in the threat analysis, and will this also have consequences when defining, for example, priorities? And for me, it's very important whether they really dare setting those priorities. That's a big question to me. Thank you very much. When it comes to financial issues, it's getting interesting, of course. So the question for human security also plays a very important part in the works of Simone Schnabel. Welcome to you as well. And she's a PhD student at the Foundation of Peace and Conflict Research, so mainly about African peace and conflict architecture. Before, she worked for GIZ as an advisor and portfolio manager. And besides, together with Antonia, which has just finished a study on peace political coherence in Mali and Niger, among other things, about perceptions and action of the federal government, which they analyze there. It's a very interesting study, by the way. I can really recommend it. Maybe today you can give us some insight to your research work in Sahel, in how Germany is perceived in its crisis management and how well Germany is prepared for that. Thank you for having me and for this very exciting discussion so far. So you mentioned it already. We have made this study on behalf of the Advisory Board for Crisis Prevention and Peace Promotion for the coherence of German action in Mali and Niger, together with my colleague Antonia Witt and also with two other researchers from the region, Babata Komuno from Mali and Abdou Kaloum Saidou from Burkina Faso, which mainly gave us the local perception of German commitment in the region in Mali and Niger. And very similar to the outcome which you have just presented, we also could see that Germany as a whole is perceived as a very honest broker and has quite a high reputation. So it's also seen positively that German commitment is very close to the population due to some agricultural projects, and also is relatively coherent and in line with the guidelines of the German government from 2017, which among other facts where the German government is also committing to human rights and a coherent approach in cooperation. So altogether, German commitment is seen as a very positive thing. However, only part of this commitment is seen like that, because German involvement in the security area, in particular in the scope of MINUSMA, but mainly also within the EU-led missions, is not perceived as part of German commitment, and it's also not perceived as being coherent with the principles. So there is a certain conflict also within what Germany is doing on the ground, and with regard to security political involvement of Germany, which is not seen as being in line with the guidelines.
We need to comment this. Those EU-led missions, especially in Niger, are not perceived as being led by the EU, but being led by France, which brings me to the strategic capacity, because again, even local actors complain about a lack of strategy on behalf of Germany, because people ask there, what does it want, Germany? If you find laid down in strategic papers an orientation towards local actors, while the defense and security policy is in stark contrast with those guidelines. I think there is stuff for discussion. As an add-on to this, it has been touched upon already. Well, German commitment is carried out very much under the guidelines of departmentalization, silo thinking. Who is responsible but for local civilian actors, but also for implementation organizations that are, I think, represented here, is highly problematic. Because whenever there is not a common approach, whenever there is no comprehensive political strategy for settling regional crisis, as we have it, for example, in Mali and Niger, with this very pervasive German commitment. Follow-up question. In the study, you reach the conclusion that this understanding of stabilization is also a major point of friction. And I quote you, stabilization from the point of view of the federal government is a central tool for promotion of peace. However, to the present day, we have different concepts of stabilization among the departments and how this can promote stabilization and peace. Can you elaborate on this? Because this demarcation and the understanding of what do we want and what do we understand by stabilization as opposed to humanitarian action and humanitarian commitment, because this is a crucial conundrum. Yes, in this study or in this paper, we came to the conclusion we had so many interviews with representatives of governments, both locally and also here in Berlin, and also with NGOs. We have seen a wide variety of opinions, for example, between the Foreign Office and the Federal Ministry for Cooperation and Development. So it needs not lead to contradictions by necessity, but it leads to inconsistencies. Whenever the development cooperation, which is based on cooperation between governments, takes too little account of the fact that the government that you are supporting is part of the problem and is also part of the causative factors. So in future, we need to take a closer look at points where civilization does not produce the desired outcomes. It's a sad reality. This, if our action, on the contrary, undermines stabilization, because in the last years, the federal government has given more and more resources to Mali, both the defense ministry and also the Ministry for Cooperation and Development. And at the same time, the military budget has also increased. So it's not just enough to demand more money for humanitarian aid, but you need to demand also that it needs to be embedded, it must be integrated into a comprehensive approach. Because if we stop thinking about prevention in a holistic way, then we would end up with paying more and more for humanitarian aid without changing anything about the root causes of the disasters. Humanitarian aid is needed at an 80% rate in crisis and conflict zones. In the context of the humanitarian commitment of the federal government, but also of international agencies, a holistic strategy, a comprehensive strategy is needed. Now, our third panelist, Christian Katzer, since 1999, he has been active for MSF, Médecins Sans Frontières, in operative projects in Somalia, Afghanistan, and East Timor, but then also in the main office in Berlin, in a leading management function, but also with a clear connection to operations. For 2 years, he has been general director at Médecins Sans Frontières Germany. Welcome, Christian. We have just listened to two pleas for more interconnectedness. These initiatives do exist inside the humanitarian sector. Look at the interconnectedness of humanitarian and peace activities in the triple nexus and also in the grand bargain. It is a thoroughgoing demand. I'm sure you are formulating already on your lips your response to this, how predictive and how stabilization humanitarian aid should be. Would you care to tell us how MSF looks at these issues? I think this promises to be a very exciting panel. Looking around. Well, I cannot agree on everything that has been said. The Zeitenwende, this motto, well, it somehow runs against my general feeling. This concept of a Zeitenwende that was brought up only this year is clearly a combination of humanitarian aid and political and military action. From a humanitarian point of view, it's extremely risky for our activity. In June this year, Olaf Scholz, the federal chancellor, stated, in order to provide defense measures to Ukraine, we will certainly strengthen humanitarian aid, but also the military support to Ukraine by providing weaponry. So it's a mixture of humanitarian action and military action, which cannot be. Because this may lead to a condition where humanitarian actors are exposed to risk, which will certainly also lead to fatal misunderstandings and misperceptions, because humanitarian aid workers can be seen as supporting one side of the conflict. Humanitarian aid is always unconditional, must be unconditional at all times. This mingling with political purposes is risky. We have seen it again during the G7 foreign ministers meeting in September. Again, well, to alleviate the suffering of the population in Ukraine and to preserve sovereignty and territorial integrity. Ukraine will continue to receive humanitarian, military, and economic aid. Again, a very fatal and disastrous mingling of political, military, and humanitarian action. We have seen this not for the last time in Afghanistan, where this mingling of political purposes and monetary aid cannot function. With the seizure of power by the Taliban, all organizations that somehow worked in a mixture had to stop their activity altogether because it was not clear. Well, the Taliban say, okay, on which side have you been throughout these years? Have you built up schools, or have you provided military help, or have you provided humanitarian aid? So take your stance. So for us, it is clear. Those who had provided exclusively humanitarian aid, they were allowed to stay. This is not a surprise, because it's utterly important to have this clear demarcation nexus. We see high risks as MSF in this mixture of purposes. It must be clear, both for the actors, both for governments, non-governmental organizations, civil organizations, and also humanitarian organizations. It must be clearly visible. What am I doing here? Why am I here? What is my purpose? Only thanks to this demarcation will you be safe to provide humanitarian assistance in Niger and Mali. Well, humanitarian aid being prepped up is good, but well, okay, you save human lives. That's the desired outcome. Yes, that's the purpose, or the entire purpose: saving, rescuing people. But that this is interconnected with other types of interventions, well, is open to discussion. It is utterly important. Well, how can German foreign policy reposition itself, for example, to support humanitarian aid. Here we are seeing already now as a medical actor in so many countries, we see room for change so as to reposition the federal government to support humanitarian aid. Let me also make a passionate plea. The two studies that have been presented, the humanitarian aid provided by the federal government is seen as rather independent. And I think it should stay so. Chancellor Scholz in June and Minister Baerbock in November have triggered a mixture. I think it's an own goal. It's you are shooting in your knee when you do that. Okay, we will come back to this in the second round. I would ask you, Simone, this study or the paper that you mentioned reaches the conclusion very clearly that we need to complain a certain lack of coherence and strategic consistency in African countries. Where is the glitch and what is needed? Very well, so I take pleasure. May I respond to Mr. Katzer? My plea was not, well, there is enough money for humanitarian aid. That was not my statement. What I wanted to say is the number of refugees, the number of those who need humanitarian help is the expression and the implication of a certain commitment for stabilization and for peacekeeping that has failed. Because why do we have yet ever more crises? Because we have more violence, both of government and non-government actors against the civilians. It's important that an actor like Germany and other countries be still committed. Yes, it's extremely important, but I would like to refer to the fact, and what is also elaborated on in our paper, and we follow up on this nexus debate. There is a high degree of coordination on the administrative, for example, GAIP or the work staff, operative staff, Sahel, operational agreements between various chief players. Well, so much has happened since the last attempts were made in stabilizing a country, for example, in Afghanistan. But what is missing is a content fill-up. How can the federal government, together with the various departments, how can you contribute to this purpose of creating a stable, a permanent and sustainable peace, for example, by analyzing action and impact? And probably well-meant tools can have a negative counterindication and can undermine each other. To avoid that, you need strategic reflection that can spell it out. Where do we want to go? What is our endpoint? How do we want to chip in our substantial contributions from various departments? And I need to evaluate this. We are seeing it now. Will we shift our security policies to Niger? But, well, we need to take a closer look at what has failed in Mali. For 20 years, we've seen an EU-led mission. This has never been evaluated, has never been analyzed. But we need such an analysis. At the same time, we need much more understanding, much more analysis of the local conflict scenario. And this must be fed back into humanitarian aid, but also other fields of policy. Thank you, Simone. Sarah, I have read a quote by Wolfgang Schmidt, head of the Federal Chancellery. He says Germany is still a teenager in the area of foreign policy. At the same time, the new security strategy should provide forward-looking solutions. Ms. Müller said so, the leader of the parliamentary group. What is needed in terms of resources to make our action future-proven? Well, may I also add two nuances to the ongoing debate. As to the topic of stabilization, well, it goes into this direction of future-proofing, foreseeing, predictive capacity. My main field of research, what is the cognitive biases that we are carrying in our heads? The optimistic bias. Normally, you think the things that you are working on should work out fine and nothing can go wrong. This is the topic of stabilization, because what is being done? Well, the idea is you want to support the services for basic needs so that people locally have the impression the government contributes to this state of affairs. So you bolster trust in government. For example, you need a guest government that is friendly to you because you think that is somehow a contribution to positive development. But the nuance is also not always will you have to deal with centralized structures. You are also working in countries that are highly decentralized, for example, Iraq. In certain regions of the country, you would focus on the local perception so that the local population gets the feeling, okay, our local government can do it. They can lay the foundations for a safe and healthy life. Well, the big problem is if you, once you come up with this optimistic bias and you have a military coup, and all of a sudden, overnight, you have a government with who you cannot no longer cooperate. Stabilization will get into troubled waters. What can you do in such a situation? Probably you will then move forward, not only in postponing the decisions. We are waiting for the decisions concerning Mali, but it's around the corner. The second point that I want to make, this intermingling in this quote by Olaf Scholz, well, I cannot look into Mr. Scholz's head, but coming back to this entire Zeitenwende buzzword, well, in the huge framework of security policy, this message that is there, that is also true. Germany has benefited from the fact that other countries have invested in their defense, with which Germany has struck alliances. So Germany had to do makeshift without any own investment. Now this balance has shifted. Normally, Germany was committed to the soft topics. Well, we do rather much in humanitarian aid, Afghanistan, for example. All those humanitarian and development goals, even in the military, well, in the Sahel, we are not the guys for the dirty work. No, we help and assist the French. So the political pressure towards international partners, because the complaint is Germany does not provide enough weapons, but we do say, well, we do provide the weaponry that we can do without, but apart from that, we do all the humanitarian groundwork and so on. But that's not enough. That is the political framing. Now, the humanitarian position that would claim, okay, we call on maintaining humanitarian principles. I support it wholeheartedly, but when push comes to shove, and I would like to hear from you a response. What about actors that move beyond the basic principles that are committed to democratic fundamental values, civil rights, and things like that, that are also close to our heart? And we want to make sure that people can live to these democratic standards also elsewhere. For example, in Ukraine. What's your stance on this? Because I think you can spell it out by the instance of Ukraine. Yes, there are certain players that draw on humanitarian principles alone. They need to be able to legitimate themselves. But Beyond that, we want to insist on implementing certain values that go beyond the humanitarian values, things like democracy, fairness, equity, freedom of speech, and things like that. Probably, how can we reconcile these two purposes? Other people here in this room can give a better answer. Future-proofing, forward, is a buzzword. It makes me cross. I'm a think tanker. You need to wrap up a very attractive gift paper, so you attach a title to this, I think, and the politicians will tell you that's also true for resilience. Okay, let's write it also on the wrap, on the packaging. But it's not lived out by the content. So you can write. The EU is very good in dressing up these parcels with nice buzzwords. Yes, of course, I agree. The basic misunderstanding to foresee is not a prophecy for the future. It's just about presenting oneself more robust and in a more forward-looking way for any eventuality. And I think from the peace policies can learn from humanitarian aid because they have a full stock of information. What are we safe to know? What can we predict? What can we expect? What might occur in the future? I need to cut short my response. Let me also advertise my own. With a finance security blog, we also finance a podcast series on early warning and reaction. It's very much zooming in on those topics. How can we improve our early warning systems? So the extensive answer will go more throughout and in depth. Now, the various conflictualities between contrasting targets, humanitarian aid, diplomacy, and development goals. We've heard so much about the government level. We talked also, you have also a representative of the civilian organizations. Christian, let me ask you. A clear emergency aid, humanitarian aid is in part also embedded in long-term crisis, therefore also fulfilling a stabilizing function because humanitarian workers have to be present for a longer time. So beyond the life-saving mandate, they provide more thoroughgoing assistance. So questions arise for an actor like MSF in providing humanitarian aid to civil society. If you look into the future, just some years, what are the changes foreseeable for humanitarian actors in the near future? Well, I was already predicting that it would be an exciting debate. From our point of view, yes, one thing is clear. The humanitarian system in itself and also humanitarian actors act according to, or are in a change. The third factor, the climate crisis, is the most fundamental one. The other two things, have come up repeatedly. We have seen it endlessly. For one thing, nature, the nature of violent conflicts is changing somehow. We see it in many contexts. Away from a conflict between a governmental actor and a non-governmental actor or various governments. More urban violence, for example, in Haiti, where the actors need to rethink their stance. They need to find a new path to enable their work being carried on. And we see more and more attacks carried out against civilian targets, civilian structures, in a rather systematic way. Quite often we do not see a clear-cut condemnation of those terrorist attacks. For example, if we say, we provide weapons, yes, of course, it is clear that counterattacks will be carried out. I find it extremely difficult to differentiate. The second comment, I do not see a conflict between humanitarian and human rights, but what I see, state building and humanitarian action must be separated. Well, I would never say we are not acting in favor of human rights. No, I would. Health, access to health facilities is a human right. So medical aid as such has a clear relationship to human rights. So I would not split the two things apart. Government formation, state building, and humanitarian aid. Well, there cannot be an overlap or a cooperation. Well, if you want to improve foreign policy in Germany, please make sure that in the foreign policy that crises become less in numbers, that we need less humanitarian aid. You must not ask what's the responsibility of the humanitarians. We will give more money to you, so make sure that the humanitarian impact is mitigated. Those who flee from Mali, that they be provided with the necessary assistance. That's not job. No, it's the job of the politicians to make sure that not longer any such situations are created in which people face these dire catastrophes. The degree and also the orientation of humanitarian funds must be adjusted to the needs. Ukraine, 80% funded, and I have now 25% underfunding for Chad, 25% underfunded for Chad, for other countries. There is a huge gap. If you look closer, German money, if this is supposed to be independent, if it is being funneled elsewhere, yeah, you could guide it, you could lead it, you could ask the players to bring proposals that look into what's going on in Yemen. I think we could here exercise a certain political management in a more coordinated. I found it rather frightening statements this morning by both speakers. Yes, we only have that amount of money. I cannot spend any euro that I have spent. That's the totally wrong approach. Well, we have so many more challenges, so we have to pay much more. It's quite as simple as that. We must say, oh, you are right. So, okay, give me a little chunk of this and I accept it willingly. Now we need extremely increased amounts of money, both for prevention and assistance and relief. We as civilian society and we as humanitarian actors need to push hard on politicians. No, you as politicians, as German government, must live up to your responsibility. We, as being the country of Germany, are one of the creators of those crises. So we need to take on our responsibility. We must make sure that this disaster cannot go on. Humanitarian aid may be a part of the response, but the ultimate responsibility, but to carry forward the responsibility on the shoulders of the humanitarians is the wrongest approach possible. We need to act more in parallel. Well, only a very short fraction is being done of what needs to be done. Very briefly on the long-term prospect, long-term conflicts, I do not believe that the humanitarian aid will have a stabilizing effect. On the contrary, quite often the case from my own perspective is that in Chad, for example, humanitarian aid is wherever it has been present for a very long time, it's because nothing else happens. Humanitarian aid might also impede the access of civilian or political actors. Frankly speaking, I don't take it. I don't believe this. It's clear we need to ask, what do we have to do once we stay for such a long time? Our own approach must be adjusted. Quite often it's just cry out loud.
So if we treat the same child for malnutrition 2 times in a row, we automatically will see that this should not be the case. But it's not a reason because we are there. This is just because other things don't happen, because there is no resilience being built up, that there are different conflicts which we are treating. But what we can do is we can create awareness that we are treating the child in the second time for the second time, and the political players have to act, and that is where it comes together, and we have to make people aware. Of course, we have to sit down in the same room and to discuss without reflecting this into humanitarian aid or putting the blame on the humanitarian aid. So we as humanitarian players should again ask the questions again and again how this question should be tackled. And just shortly about the climate crisis, I believe that is extremely important to deal with the subject, both from the point of view of humanitarian actors, to ask for our role as humanitarian players, to our influence in the climate crisis, and to adjust our own way of working. And at the same time, it's clearly necessary as well that we should play the ball back to politicians, saying that the national health authorities and other institutions should be supported to create more resilience and to adapt to the new reality. Due to global warming, some diseases may show up again, which have already disappeared. And that makes the population extremely vulnerable because there is no protection, and that the health system is also unable to help. That may create a lot of death toll. And humanitarian aid, of course, can intervene in such situations, but it's not the answer to the big questions. And that is why some unavoidable climate effects have to be supported in advance, rather than just waiting for the humanitarian aid to act and to respond in the worst case to save people at the last moment. But there's a lot of work which has to come first. Thank you. Let me remind you that we will take questions in a second, but also the online audience can put their questions on the chat.
In English, if you feel more comfortable, we will accommodate both languages. I
think it's very interesting to look at the aspect of human security, because that's also a point of view which could unite a lot of players in their view about whose security is at stake at all, and how in what interests are we actually committing. Christian, you mentioned the aspect that there can be no humanitarian solutions for political problems. At the same time, however, when looking at Afghanistan, at Mali, stabilization missions are not having the best reputation presently, and they are losing some part of their credibility as well. Let me quote Zara's report on the network approach. She is writing that the problem of the networked approach is that many things should be tackled at the same time. This does not mean networking already, and even better networking is no convincing foreign political strategy. They are rather making complicated the work between missions of different sides. Let me ask you, therefore, when we look at human security, and when this is our common view, how can the target conflicts be solved between all the various areas? Who wants to answer that question? Well, the networked approach makes me smile a little bit, because in Mali, I talked to a representative of the German armed forces. They told me that this does simply not exist. And I think that was a very bold answer, driven by the debate in the Bundestag. And you have to take a very close look at what the targets are and how these targets can be reached. And now I would like to answer again one of our questions and come back to one of the results of our study. It needs, and I said this already this afternoon, the federal government needs in Mali and also in other contexts for stabilization, they need a country-specific overall strategy approaching the local situation rather than being designed in Brussels and implementing those decisions made in Brussels. So that does not mean it is also very easy to say that the federal government needs a strategy. We also know about how volatile the situation on the ground really is, but this really needs to look forward and to think in scenarios which may come true, which may happen. And I'm asking myself whether our German government also is thinking that in Niger, only in 2010, they had the last coup d'etat by the military, or if they say the next time, oh, how come we did not know that? Actually, it's a region which is shattered by many coups and characterized by such events. So what I'm saying is that a strategy does not mean that this is the way forward and we are going on that way. The strategy means to design different scenarios and forecast several scenarios and also include some retreat options, for instance, for military missions of the German armed forces, rather than just waiting for Russia to step in and going out then. I think you have to think of those situations before they happen. And that's the task of a strategic discussion, which should at best be held at the highest level of ministries and between ministries, and ideally they should also be based on the guidelines of the German government. And this is of course not free from conflicts. There are target conflicts certainly, but we have to talk about this, and we also have to talk about this with governments, and unpleasant subjects have to be tackled as well. And they have to think, well, those are the principles, and how do we handle them? That does not mean that this can all be implemented according to these catalogs of questions, but it takes a dialogue, and it takes some thinking of what we want to achieve and how the partner feels who might not be thinking the same way and not having perhaps the right government in our view. But it can't also be the consequence of such situation that any commitment will be disrupted. And I think what we have to do is we have to find a common target within the German government, and also to have a more intensive dialogue with the local governments, but also with the civil society, of course, beyond the capitals. So what about human security? Is this rather a pair of glasses for we can use all of us, or just let me quote again. The quotation comes from the networked approach, where we thought that that Germany would have an answer to everything, to all the problems in our political commitment. There is already some truth in it, that there was lacking coordination between various ministries and politics in particular, because different parties are having different ministries. This is another problem. Coordination is a problem and needs to be worked at, and therefore the national security strategy will now be perhaps some kind of umbrella document and some coordinating basis which can take us a step forward. But in order to say, like it was said, that networking is not a strategy in itself, this networking alone will not do the trick. And I think when we are now coming to the point to show all the threats in this, and I'm really in agreement with Christian Katzer when he says that the threats resulting from that, because we also looked at the peace targets or our commitment towards peace of a big humanitarian actor in the system, in order to give some recommendations how one can contribute more to peace in military commitment. And the outcome was also, as we heard before, better do no harm, back to the basics. because it's of no point to pretend that humanitarian aid at no point would be free from any impacts on the political situation. However, at the same time, pushing forward, making project with other peace actors, and then everything would be networked. Why do no harm components would not be implemented properly. From our point of view, this analysis would lead to the wrong approaches, and so certain things should really be done right. And it's also very important to say that the problem starts where conflicts are breaking out, not really where humanitarian aid can help once conflicts have happened or broken out. And as Simone has said, you also said we made a study, follow the money, how the money is being spent for crisis prevention by the German government. And what we could see was that the money was rather spread widely, a little bit to all the projects and everywhere in the world without setting priorities. Germany wanted to be present everywhere, multilaterally, working in partnerships, but then it comes to a point where it really can make a difference by the soft power, whether it really makes a difference if I just set up a nice project which does not do harm in some places, but that is rather kind of a diplomatic goal rather than a political goal, because when it's coming to preventing violence, we really have to think what is really going to be the impact, and there we have to think more strategically. So in order to prevent conflicts from breaking out, because once a conflict is there already, just let us look at the Russian-Ukraine discussion. The problem is not that Russia does not want their own people to be given medical care, but if the staff is attacked, it's because it's instrumentalized, because there is a conflict. So this is in principle the root cause to which it's boiling down. And therefore, it's good that this continues to be a priority. At the same time, I'm not buying into the argument that if we invest in humanitarian aid, we can't invest elsewhere. I think this can only be a technical problem. Somebody has to explain this to me as well. May I just add, so when you mentioned your buzzwords, prevention came to my mind immediately, and this needs to be a central part of the overall strategy for a specific crisis context. This needs to be thought up to the end, where you cannot just think of individual instrument or making some check marks with the characteristic figures, etc. So when it comes to strategy, the federal government is now writing a big strategy. You mentioned the national security strategy. We've got also a feministic foreign policy strategy, and there is also in the pipeline the strategy for humanitarian aid, which is about to be revised. And what is important to me is to say we have to separate what needs to be separated. We have to come back to humanitarian aid and political goals, but we also have to join what needs to be joined. And from our point of view, it's obvious that foreign policy can put a lot of political weight into points where we want to fight against the root causes, and where this could mean concretely that we should prioritize, we should not mix up humanitarian aid with political goals. And clearly the rooms and the conditions for humanitarian aid should be defended. Blockades of countries to certain access should be mentioned openly, and we should sharply criticize these things, and that can go hand in hand with the spreading of humanitarian aid and money to those countries. Germany can indeed put a certain focus there and has also a big responsibility in that respect. On the other hand, Germany needs to put more focus on principle-guided humanitarian aid. We have the situation that since Germany started the call for action in the for respect humanitarian law and humanitarian action, and came up with this idea. And in the meantime, this has been accepted and ratified by 150 countries. But on the other hand, we see initiatives by France, for example, which clearly veto this when it comes to give an exceptional approval for humanitarian aid in sanctioned regimes. This is a clear political conflict, and Germany can take a very clear position. They started this course for action, and at the international level, they can really discuss with France how they can block such an initiative. And there is a lot of room for political action in order to allow humanitarian aid without using political aid or linking political aid to political goals with humanitarian aid, because other states and other governments, of course, look very closely of what's happening and where we respond and where we don't. And then, of course, the Ethiopian government will prevent our access to Tigray because for them it's not safe enough. And then, of course, at the foreign policy, one can oppose this attitude, and Germany has to take a much bigger role, play a much bigger role in that respect. Thank you. Now let me look into the audience, and please feel free to use the microphone if you have any question. When I see look into this room, I can see there are no current questions from the online audience. But please introduce yourself. I'm Cornelia Füllkrug-Weitzel. I'm a pensioner, and before that I spent 21 years of the diachronic disaster management and Board für die Welt. There are lots of things which are very strange to me. Let's start with networking. You say networking, but rightfully Ms. Schnabel has pointed out that networking is actually not the subject, my friends. The idea of networking came about, as far as I can remember, for the first time in the context of Kosovo and Serbia. And then it was actually started by Joschka Fischer, the then foreign minister of Germany, and in order to support Florian Katzer, Christian Katzer, what the consequences can be for humanitarian aid. Joschka Fischer invited the Committee for Humanitarian Aid and wanted this to be very important. And now all humanitarian aid would come in line with democratization efforts, and humanitarian aid would only be provided to forces which would potentially topple Milosevic. That is actually nonsense, because we always support also communities, and we do not ask refugees whether they are pro or contra Milosevic in order to receive humanitarian aid. In practice, this is absolute nonsense to make this difference. But beyond that, politically, that was perceived well in Serbia. And I was taken to prison for that reason, because they told me, you want a regime change instead of humanitarian aid. This is really dangerous and actually stupid, number one. Secondly, who has promoted this mix of values and players? Again and again, that was done by the Federal Ministry of Defense. They always invited for humanitarian and development NGOs and foreign policy and defense representatives. And of course, the Defense Ministry has a certain interest, and I can understand from their point of view. They want to get information from the civil society in the field of humanitarian aid. And of course, they want to make use of that information. But there were some civil society organizations over all the decades which don't think this is an ideal setup, because it also contradicts the principles. Now let me mention humanitarian principles and human rights again. Why shouldn't they be mixed up? Why not? Those are values which are having a totally different political context, and which also are targeting different things. One thing is how generally democratic, peaceful, and peace-capable and just societies can be created based on human rights, can be stabilized, etc. There, of course, this all should be in. And the other side is, if worse comes to worse, if it's really breaking out a conflict, and if for long we cannot speak about democracy or human rights at all, what shall be done in such a situation? And the humanitarian international law has been created in a totally different context than human rights. They are not talking about the ideal society. They just want to make sure that in a violent context, they want to limit violence. They can't do more, and they don't want to do more. In order to achieve that, they need to be they need to recognize all. They need the recognition of all conflicting parties. And at the same time, when you want to do this, you can't promote regime change at the same time. That's obvious, isn't it? Human security, and let me start again with you. Networking again. Indeed, this is not the right buzzword for what politics needs. Also, the Commission of Refugee Root Causes, which I'm a part of, said what is missing is not coordination or networking. What is missing is a clear political goal and strategy. The objective basically is having peace and the peace policy. There was a debate about human security. And by the way, it's not an empty word. It's a well-filled concept. Berghoff Foundation and Ebert Foundation have worked long on this subject. It was discussed at EU level and then trashed. But the content is it should be a complementary concept for military security. And military security, there may be moments that it's necessary where it's necessary, but looking at the basic concept, the approach was whose security? It's about the everyday security and social security of people. If indeed, when you apply certain forms of military security, that may even be undermined. The whole human part came up in the UN, where they found out that the largest destroyer of development efforts are wars. And so what helps us any kind of having any kind of security concept if at the same time development is undermined? And I'm really interested to look to see when you say that in the new strategy the development concept will be there. That is not fitting at all. That means we want to have a new militarization of security. How this should come together, I don't know. And what is now looking like a feminist look on security that has long been there, but it has never been implemented. But what is needed is to say in this context, what are the concrete conflict causes nationally and internationally? In most conflicts, there are not only society or social players, but at some point, the military component comes in. But this needs to be looked at in the course of an overall strategy. First of all, we have to know what is the right strategy in this context. And secondly, what is the target? Do we have the target of human security? Do we have the target of giving preference to non-violent dealing with conflicts? And to my mind, everything is being mixed up right now in this debate, even in this room, but also this discussion is just reflecting the situation at other levels as well. Another question?
Hi.
Frederick Ranitzscha of the World Food Programme. Mr. Katzer is absolutely right. We are in a very unacceptable situation in many crises contexts because we have to do again and again coming up with the same, treating the same people and supporting the same people with humanitarian aid, which is actually an unacceptable situation. And we heard a lot about the question of how we can get away from that situation. Again and again, we've mentioned the words of resilience and development and diplomacy and the way how to solve conflicts, adaptation to climate change. And all of a sudden, the range of the subjects is getting very wide. And then the individual players are also getting more and more. And the things I'm really thinking about, or what makes me concerned, is that I don't see that the incentive structures either in the humanitarian system, in the UN systems, or within the German governments are put in a way that they could support serious cooperation, that they really could promote the capability for a new strategy, but also the step which is here mentioned by the word of networking, that this is really taken seriously, because it would be an enormous progress if humanitarian players would speak to development players. There are so many institutional gaps, as to my mind, both in the German government, but also in all other systems involved. So that I'm asking myself, how can we design incentive systems? How can we stop talking about it and starting to do things? And what are the triggers in order to improve the situation? Because we are all failing miserably in capability for a new strategy, but also when it comes to to other questions. Thank you. And another question from the chat. Unfortunately, not from the chat. I have a question of my own and take the liberty to ask it. Thank you, first of all, for this panel. I think it's incredibly inspiring and listening to you. But my question refers to the we are talking about, and I would like to throw into this debate, what is this monetary we like? Does it refer to the question of coherence at the governmental level, or do you mean what Christian Katzer has criticized in the discussion, that we have to tackle the government? And I'm asking myself a little bit, what is the common denominator of all the players who claim that they want to provide humanitarian aid? Thank you. We have 4 minutes left. Maybe you want to respond to the first comment for a larger differentiation of the debate, and also the question of human security and feminist foreign policy. How does this go together? And maybe you would like to speak about the humanitarian and regarding the incentive structures. So please, if you don't mind. Otherwise, the next panel, whereas the speaker of the next panel will also deal with those questions in particular. Okay, now, yeah, let me just start. The longer comment at the beginning, I believe that the narrative of intervention in stabilization context has undergone many changes in the last 20 years, from Kosovo via Afghanistan now to Mali, Sahel, whatever. Promoting democracy is definitely no more in the first place. That has been pushed to the background, and clearly we also are interested in building up democratic structures. But the problem is that, and I think especially from Afghanistan, we have learned that the federal government and the international players have had too high ambitions, but saying that primarily, and that's the problem we discussed in this panel too, it's that the debate is focusing too much on the security aspects of all the approaches. And I would like to add, because you said that a political strategy at the international and national level. So what I wanted to say earlier, especially when asking for a better strategy for such contexts, is that we have to look more locally. What is there in terms of local conflict solving mechanisms and players? Where can we start working reasonably? And also the representative of WFP, that was your organization. I'm asking myself as well, to what extent is this already linked to work together with local peace initiatives and local dialogue processes in order to negotiate even a fragile peace at a local level? To what extent is that linked to humanitarian intervention, for example? And there I see certain ways for improvement rather than just asking for the common budget. Yes, thank you for the questions. And I think the first and the second questions, they go together quite well, because we heard on the one hand that things are very clear, humanitarian principles are like that, and that's why they were invented, and people have thought about that. And the question is then, why is it so complicated anyway? Why do we have so many hiccups? And the second question also came to the point, how can we really advance? We are all failing, so why don't we change the situation? And my conviction is, and we mentioned this earlier when we talked about the work in the national security strategy, to what extent is the social society involved, the civil society involved in our foreign policy? How is the civil society involved at all in designing this strategy? I think there is much more room for involving the civil society, for consulting and using the expertise. One thing is what we want to try to do with the security bloc, but it's no point, it doesn't help to again and again design those concepts and explain them as very clear concepts, because we don't fail because the decision-making level at the political level does not understand why it works. Why it fails is the point when it comes together at a person like Olaf Scholz, and he is now exposed to pressure from several directions and has to put everything together somehow and make the decision at the highest political level, but also at the lower bureaucratic levels in technical implementation. And I often have the feeling, and that's also the challenge when I observing this, why doesn't this advance? Why we spend so little time to talk about this together, what actually the challenges of each side are in this implementation, rather than standing there and saying, well, this is the concept, and is it clear, and why didn't you implement it? And this is exactly something where we try to approach in different ways. You also said you wanted to have somebody from the political side at this panel, which would be the ideal interaction point. But this would be my plea. And finally, I wanted to say, for me, it's great to be here. And I also like these debates because the humanitarian sector is much more progressive and much more advanced than the political security debate in many aspects. That's why we need humanitarian players also in the debates on the national security strategy and peace politics. But at the same time, we have to think of how it can work, that we can really come together and that we can really find solutions.
Thank you very much. Probably we do not want to come together. Well, in the end, because so you can repeat the principles and the reasons why you hope that they will come to. Probably I'm too optimistic. It may be an illusion. You fulfill a function, but whenever I see somebody being upset, then I keep repeating my tenets. I have been repeating this for 20 years. It's part of humanitarian aid. We must not be frustrated. Even we treat the same child again and again, but it's not the mistake committed by the child, but a mistake committed by us. We run up against the same walls and get a bloody nose. It may be frustrating, but it's part and parcel of our commitment. That's why we reach this humanitarian. We are quite often blamed as being too egotistical. Well, we are being criticized for being too stubborn, but things are very complex. It must be. Yes, we can make demands, and we do. We are not experts in politics. We cannot offer quick fixes or solutions, but we can only repeat, for political problems, you must find for political problems, and we must provide humanitarian help to people in need at the right moment. We need to have this distinction of remits. Yes, the solutions must be of a political nature. That one is clear. Supporting cooperation. Well, I think we have many organizations here in this room who offer you a hodgepodge of so many different things, activities, and responsibilities. Not so this interconnectedness, well, may also be present in the various actors because, well, but for a small exception, because you work in so many different fields of the government. Humanitarian action, development is given money, and also nation building from a private view. Yeah, we do have opportunities inside the ministries. They are sitting around one table. We have the humanitarian department of the ministry sitting here, and also the development politics department, and also the humanitarian department. Why wouldn't it work out? Why don't you talk to each other? So you might come up with a local solution, but once again, it's not my speciality. Well, I would rather say I must abstain from a clear judgment. Yes, there is a clear political responsibility to end conflicts, not to let them trundle out of control. You need to react to the climate crisis. And this responsibility rests not with the humanitarian actors. With this clear plea, we want to conclude this session. I hear, so stick to your guns. We must become better in doing no harm, but also in conflict sensitivity and in prevention of conflicts. But at the same time, we must keep in touch with the various actors. We must understand what our respective background is, what the values are, what the positions are. Let me point out once again, in the lobby, we do have some pin walls. If you want to take out, if you have taken out a key takeaway, if you want to pin it or to attach it to your mirror in the bathroom, the next panel will be on challenges of humanitarian coordination and humanitarian Zeitenwende. Then we have now a 25-minute break. Thank you.